The first time American troops faced a major defeat in World War II, it didn't happen in the Pacific, and it didn't happen against Japan. It happened in North Africa, against a German force that was faster, more experienced, and led by one of the most dangerous commanders of the war. In early 1943, U.S. soldiers, many of them fresh, untested, and confident in their training, were suddenly thrown into a brutal reality they were not prepared for. What they encountered was not just an enemy, but a style of warfare that moved faster than their decisions, struck harder than their expectations, and exposed weaknesses they didn't yet know they had. Within days, positions collapsed, communication broke down, and entire units found themselves overwhelmed. This was not supposed to happen. The United States had entered the war with growing industrial power and rising confidence. But on the battlefield, confidence meant nothing without experience, and in North Africa, that lesson came fast. Before we go deeper into how this defeat unfolded and why it shocked American command, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Confidential for more real, historically accurate World War II stories. No fiction, no exaggeration. Only what truly happened based on records, reports, and testimonies. Because what you're about to hear is not just the story of a battle, but the moment the U.S. Army was forced to confront its own limitations. The confrontation took place near the Kasserine Pass, a narrow corridor in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia, where American forces believed they could hold the line. But they were facing troops under the command of Erwin Rommel, a commander who had already built a reputation for exploiting exactly this kind of situation. He studied weaknesses quickly, moved with precision, and struck where defenses were thin. And as American units began to settle into their positions, Rommel was already preparing to test them. The U.S. forces in the region were spread out, often poorly coordinated, and led by officers who lacked combat experience against a highly mobile enemy. Defensive positions were established, but they were rigid, predictable, and in many cases poorly supported. Communication between units was inconsistent, and intelligence about German movements was incomplete or delayed. Meanwhile, German forces, alongside experienced armored units, began probing these positions, looking for gaps. They didn't need to attack everywhere. They only needed to find where the Americans were weakest. And once they did, the attack would come fast, concentrated, and with overwhelming force. What the U.S. troops didn't yet realize was that they were about to face a type of coordinated assault that combined speed, artillery, and armored breakthroughs in a way they had never experienced before. When the attack finally began, it didn't unfold as a slow, predictable engagement. It hit suddenly, exploiting confusion and fragmentation within the American lines. German armor pushed through Kiev, supported by artillery, that disrupted any attempt to reorganize. Units that were supposed to support each other found themselves isolated, unable to communicate or respond effectively. Orders were delayed or misunderstood, and in the chaos, defensive plans quickly became irrelevant. Soldiers who had expected to hold their ground were forced into rapid retreats, often without clear direction. And as the situation escalated, it became clear that this was no minor setback. It was the first major test of American forces against a seasoned enemy, and they were not passing that test. As the German assault intensified, the weaknesses within the American lines became impossible to ignore. What had started as localized pressure quickly turned into a full-scale breakthrough. German armored units didn't just attack. They maneuvered, bypassing strong points and cutting deep into rear positions where command posts, supply depots, and communication hubs were located. This created immediate confusion. American officers struggled to understand where the main attack was coming from, while frontline units received conflicting or outdated orders. Some were told to hold their ground at all costs, while others were suddenly ordered to withdraw, often without coordination. The result was fragmentation. Units that were meant to operate together were now isolated, reacting individually rather than as a unified force. And in modern warfare, that kind of disorganization is exactly what an experienced enemy exploits. Rommel's approach was methodical. He did not waste time attacking fortified positions head-on unless necessary. Instead, he identified the seams between American units, the gaps where coordination broke down, and drove his forces straight through them. Once those gaps were opened, German armor moved rapidly, forcing American troops into a reactive state. Artillery followed, targeting retreat routes and creating additional pressure. For many U.S. soldiers, this was their first exposure to a fully coordinated, combined arms attack. Tanks, infantry, and artillery working in sync, adjusting in real time, and exploiting every hesitation. It created the impression that the enemy was everywhere at once, even when their numbers were limited, and that psychological effect, uncertainty, speed, and pressure, was just as damaging as the physical losses. As positions began to collapse, the situation at the Kasserine Pass deteriorated rapidly. American defenses, initially believed to be strong enough to hold, were now being pushed back under sustained pressure. In some areas, troops abandoned equipment simply because there was no time to organize an orderly retreat. Vehicles were left behind, supply lines disrupted, and artillery units forced to relocate or risk being overrun. Attempts to regroup were complicated by the terrain. Narrow passes, limited visibility, and poor coordination between units made it difficult to establish a new defensive line. And while some officers attempted to stabilize the situation, they were often working with incomplete information, unsure of where their own forces or the enemy were positioned. Yet even in the middle of this breakdown, something began to change. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a growing realization among American commanders that the situation could not be managed with the same rigid tactics they had started with. They were facing an enemy that adapted quickly, and if they were going to survive, they would have to do the same. Reinforcements were being organized, new defensive positions considered, and communication efforts intensified. The defeat was still unfolding, but for the first time, there were signs that the Americans were beginning to understand the nature of the battle they were in, and that understanding, though late, would become the foundation for what came next. By the time reinforcements began arriving, the situation at the Kasserine Pass was already critical, but it was no longer chaotic in the same way it had been at the start. American command, shaken by the speed and scale of the German advance, began reorganizing its response with a new sense of urgency. Units were pulled back into more defensible positions. Artillery was repositioned with clearer fields of fire, and communication between divisions was tightened. Perhaps most importantly, command structures were adjusted. Officers who had struggled to respond under pressure were replaced or reassigned, and more experienced leadership was brought forward to stabilize the front. This was no longer about holding every inch of ground. It was about restoring control, slowing the enemy, and preventing a complete collapse. German forces, however, continued pressing their advantage. Having already broken through initial defenses, they aimed to exploit their momentum before the Americans could fully recover. Armored units pushed deeper, probing for another breakthrough that could turn retreat into rout. But this time, the resistance they encountered was different. American artillery, now more effectively coordinated, began to disrupt German advances with increasing accuracy. Defensive positions, though hastily prepared, were no longer isolated in the same way. Instead of scattered resistance, German units began to face concentrated firepower that forced them to slow down and reassess. The pace of the battle began to shift, not dramatically, but noticeably. What had changed was not just positioning, but mindset. American forces were beginning to adapt to the tempo and style of German operations. They started anticipating flanking movements, reinforcing vulnerable Nikkate, and using terrain more effectively to channel enemy armor into predictable routes. Air support, which had been poorly coordinated earlier in the battle, was now being integrated more deliberately, targeting advancing German units and supply lines. These adjustments did not erase the losses that had already occurred, but they began to limit further damage. For the first time since the battle began, the Germans were no longer advancing unchecked. At the same time, logistical realities began to affect the German side as well. The rapid advance that had initially given them the advantage now stretched their supply lines, limiting fuel and ammunition availability. Without the ability to maintain the same level of pressure, their operations became more cautious. The opportunity for a decisive breakthrough was slipping. Rommel, recognizing that the conditions were no longer favorable for continued aggressive action, began reconsidering his objectives. The battle, which had started as a demonstration of German superiority, was now turning into something else, a confrontation where momentum was no longer one-sided. And while the Americans had paid a heavy price to reach this point, they had begun to do something far more important than simply resist, they had learned. As the battle entered its final phase, the momentum had clearly shifted. German forces, which had advanced rapidly in the opening days, were no longer able to maintain the same level of pressure. Their attacks became more cautious, more limited, and increasingly constrained by logistical strain. Fuel shortages, extended supply lines, and growing resistance from reorganized American units forced a change in tempo. What had once been a fast-moving offensive now slowed into probing attacks and localized engagements. For the first time since the battle began, it was the Germans who were being forced to reassess their position. The opportunity to deliver a decisive blow had passed. On the American side, the transformation was becoming visible. Defensive lines were no longer improvised, they were coordinated. Artillery support was timely and concentrated. Communication between units had improved, and command decisions were being made with greater clarity. Reinforcements had stabilized, and new leadership had introduced a more flexible approach to combat. Instead of reacting blindly to German movements, American forces were beginning to anticipate them. This shift did not erase anything, but it prevented the situation from collapsing further. The line held, and in holding, it denied the Germans the breakthrough they had been seeking. Rommel, recognizing that continued attacks would yield diminishing returns, began to disengage. His earlier success had depended on speed and surprise, both of which were now gone. Without those advantages, pushing deeper into American-held territory carried increasing risk with limited reward. The battlefield had changed, and so had the balance between the two forces. What had begun as a clear demonstration of German tactical superiority was ending in a controlled withdrawal. The offensive had stalled, and with it, the chance to exploit American weakness at its most vulnerable moment. But the true significance of Kasserine was not measured only in territory gained or lost. It was measured in what it revealed. For the United States, this was a harsh but necessary lesson in modern warfare. It exposed failures in leadership, coordination, and preparedness, but it also forced rapid adaptation. The U.S. Army that emerged from Kasserine was not the same one that had entered it. Training improved, command structures were refined, and a deeper understanding of enemy tactics began to take shape. And while this battle marked their first major defeat in World War II, it also marked the beginning of something else, the process that would eventually turn those early failures into hard-earned experience on the road to victory. In the weeks following the battle, the full impact of what had happened at Kasserine Pass became clear to American leadership. This was not treated as just another setback. It was analyzed in detail, from the lowest levels of communication failures to the highest levels of command decisions. Reports highlighted poor coordination between units, ineffective leadership under pressure, and a lack of experience against a highly mobile and aggressive enemy. But instead of ignoring these failures, the U.S. Army acted on them quickly. Command changes were implemented, training programs were intensified, and a stronger emphasis was placed on flexibility in combat. The goal was not just to recover, but to ensure that this kind of defeat would not happen again. One of the most significant changes came in leadership and organization. More capable and experienced commanders were placed in key positions, and greater authority was given to officers in the field to adapt to rapidly changing situations. Communication systems were improved, allowing units to coordinate more effectively during combat. At the same time, combined arms tactics began to take shape in a more structured way. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air support were no longer treated as separate elements, but as parts of a unified system that had to operate together. This shift would prove critical in future battles where coordination and timing would become decisive factors. For the soldiers who had experienced the defeat firsthand, the lessons were more immediate and personal. They had seen what happened when preparation did not match reality, when assumptions replaced awareness, and when an experienced enemy dictated the pace of the fight. But they had also adapted. By the end of the campaign in North Africa, American forces were no longer the same untested units that had entered the battle at Kasserine. They were more disciplined, more aware, and far better prepared for the challenges ahead. The defeat had forced a level of growth that could not have been achieved through training alone. In the broader context of World War II, Kasserine Pass stands as a turning point, not because of victory, but because of transformation. It was the moment the United States confronted the reality of modern warfare against a skilled opponent and chose to adapt rather than repeat its mistakes. The early defeat did not define the American war effort. What defined it was the response, and from that response came a force that would go on to fight more effectively in North Africa, push into Europe, and eventually contribute to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The first major defeat had exposed their weaknesses. What followed ensured those weaknesses would not last.